Bonsuelo mathletes. Okay, there really isn't anything new here. So it says here, items marked with an asterisk are new. I guess more it's probably something to be aware of, but, okay, so this is just a summary of factoring. I'm gonna call this factoring by inspection, because we are gonna start doing something new, and that's factoring by inspection. By the way, by inspection, I just mean just by looking at it. So greatest common factor, difference two squares or a trinomial, perfect cubes. Okay, because eventually we're gonna, we're gonna have to factor by things you can't just do by looking at it. And that's kind of the main thrust of what the rest of this chapter is about. Okay, so first of all, there goes that bell again. First of all, what do? You look for the greatest common factor. There's an I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because this is just a summary of what you should already know. There's the greatest common factor. Sometimes the greatest common factor is a quantity. So there are two examples, they're including factoring by grouping, but that's all greatest common factor. Next is trinomial, or difference of two perfect squares. Okay. Now, I want to remind you that there are also, and I've said this to you before, there's also difference of squares and also sum of squares. So for instance here, this would also include x squared plus 1, which would factor into x plus I and x minus I. It would also include things like x squared minus 7, which would be x minus square root of 7 and x plus square root of 7, which would also include things like x squared plus 5, which would be x plus square root of 5i and x minus square root of 5i. So when I first showed you how to factor, it was the difference of two squares, this right here. But now, and since that time, it's not recently that we've done this. I've also shown you the sum of two squares. I've also shown you the difference of squares where they're not perfect squares, and the difference, or the sum of squares where they're not perfect squares. So you should know how to factor all of those, okay? All right. Next, perfect cubes, and I've shown you how to do that. I also want to emphasize that when you've factored, you should always try and factor again. This is as far as we've gone. Again, like this in the perfect cubes, the trinomial that results in the second part of the perfect cubes, you won't know how to factor that. That's okay. Well, that's kind of what we're eventually leading up to, but right now you don't know how to do it. So again, this is just a quick review of factoring by what I'm going to refer to now as factoring by inspection. So when I talk about factoring by inspection, that's what I'm talking about. Greatest common factor, trinomial or two squares, or perfect cubes. And again, perfect cubes isn't really new, but it's new to chapter 5. That's why I put, that is something new. All right? Okay, that's it. Just quick review. Bye-bye. Now we're going to start going to where you have to factor not by inspection, but by more complicated means, if something doesn't factor by inspection.